Welcome to Crossdressing Stories. Here, we share personal stories, celebrate self-expression. If you're on your own journey or simply curious, you've found your community. Subscribe and join the conversation.
The eviction notice felt thinner than it should, as if the paper itself was ashamed of the weight of its message. For the third time that week, Alex traced the bold, red letters of the word final. His life had become a series of final notices: the final disconnection warning for his internet, the final demand from his credit card company, and now this. As a freelance graphic designer, he was supposed to be the master of fonts and layouts, but the typography of his own failure was brutally effective. His apartment, once a minimalist bachelor pad, now just looked empty. He'd sold his good couch, his TV, even his espresso machine. All that remained was a mattress on the floor, his work laptop, and a diet consisting primarily of instant ramen and anxiety. That's when the call came. It was from a law firm, a name so old and prestigious it sounded like a character from a period drama. Mr. Alex Ryder. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional. "We are the executors of the estate of the late Genevieve Du Bois. Your great-aunt." Alex blinked. Aunt Genevieve? He hadn't seen her in over a decade. She was his grandmother's eccentric, globe-trotting sister, a whirlwind of Chanel No. 5, clanking bracelets, and laughter that sounded like breaking glass. She was a myth, a legend, a woman who sent postcards from Paris and Marrakesh, but never attended a family holiday. He hadn't even known she had passed. The meeting was the next day in a gleaming downtown skyscraper that made Alex feel acutely aware of the small coffee stain on his only decent shirt. The lawyer, Ms. Evelyn Reed, was a woman who seemed to be carved from polished granite. She was impeccably tailored in a charcoal suit, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe knot. Her sharp, intelligent eyes missed nothing. "Your aunt was a unique woman," Ms. Reed began, her voice betraying no emotion as she opened a thick, leather-bound document. "Her will reflects that. She has left the entirety of her considerable estate to you, Mr. Ryder." Alex's heart stopped. The entire estate? He thought of the ramen, the eviction notice. This was a lottery ticket. A miracle. "The estate," Ms. Reed continued, "includes her investment portfolio, her art collection, and her 4-story brownstone in the city's most desirable historic district." Alex felt dizzy. A brownstone. He could sell it, pay off his debts, start over. He was saved. However, Ms. Reed said, and the single word landed with the force of a gavel. "There is a condition. A rather specific one. Your aunt called it the residency and presentation clause. She adjusted her glasses and read directly from the will. To inherit my legacy, my great-nephew, Alex Ryder, must prove he understands the importance of presentation, the power of aesthetics, and the art of inhabiting a role, lessons I tried to impart on his far too sensible mother. Therefore, the inheritance is contingent upon the following: for 1 full year, he must live within the brownstone. And he must live as a woman." Alex laughed. It wasn't a sound of amusement, but a sharp, hysterical bark of disbelief that echoed in the silent, opulent office. "You're kidding. This is a joke, right? Some kind of twisted prank from beyond the grave." Ms. Reed's expression remained unchanged. "I assure you, Mr. Ryder, Genevieve Du Bois was not a woman who joked about her finances. The will is ironclad. We've had it verified by 3 independent legal experts." "Live as a woman?" Alex repeated, the words feeling alien and absurd on his tongue. "What does that even mean?" "I just have to wear a dress to dinner." The lawyer leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp as a needle. "The clause is far more detailed than that. You are to adopt a female persona. The will suggests the name Alexandra, but allows for a name of your choosing, subject to estate approval. You are to maintain a feminine appearance at all times, both within the residence and in public. This includes wardrobe, grooming, and comportment. The brownstone is fully staffed, and the head of staff, a Mrs. Davies, is designated as the arbiter of your adherence. She will provide weekly reports to this office. Any violation of the terms will result in immediate nullification of the inheritance. The precision of it, the cold, corporate language used to describe such a bizarre, personal upheaval, was nauseating. This wasn't a whim. It was a meticulously planned invasion. Why? Alex finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why would she do this? For the first time, Ms. Reed's expression softened, just a fraction. The preamble of the will states that your great-aunt believed you had inherited your mother's beige soul and were living a life of uninspired safety. She saw this not as a punishment, but as an education. A one-year, immersive course in another perspective. An education. He was about to be homeless, and his dead aunt wanted to send him to a finishing school of the absurd. The rage that had been simmering in his gut began to boil. This was humiliation. It was a posthumous power play from a woman he barely knew. He should have stood up, thrown the papers back in her face, and walked out. But the image of the eviction notice, red and final, was seared into his mind. He was trapped. Genevieve and her granite-carved lawyer knew it. Ms. Reed seemed to read his thoughts. She reached into a drawer and produced a single, ornate brass key attached to a leather tag. She slid it across the vast expanse of the desk. It came to a stop just before his trembling hands. The address is on the tag, she said, her voice returning to its crisp, businesslike tone. Mrs. Davies and the staff are expecting the arrival of Miss Alexandra Dubois this evening. You have until midnight. If you fail to arrive, the entire estate, including the brownstone and its contents, will be liquidated and the proceeds donated to the International Society for the Preservation of Antique Lace. Alex stared at the key. It was heavy, real. It was the key to a mansion, to a future free from debt and fear. It was also the key to a cage he couldn't begin to comprehend. The taxi pulled up to the brownstone just as the sky was deepening from bruised purple to inky black. Alex paid the driver with the last of his cash, the crisp bill feeling like a final offering to his old life. He stood on the sidewalk, a single backpack containing his laptop and a change of clothes slung over his shoulder, and stared up at the building. It wasn't just a house, it was a monolith of old-world elegance. For stories of dark brick with tall, mullioned windows that glowed with a warm, inviting light. A wrought iron fence enclosed a small, perfectly manicured garden, and a set of wide stone steps led up to a massive oak door, painted a glossy, defiant red. It was the kind of place he had only ever seen in magazines, a symbol of a life so far removed from his own it might as well have been on another planet. Taking a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic hummingbird in his chest, he walked up the steps. The brass key felt cold and heavy in his hand. He hesitated for a long moment, the key hovering over the lock. This was it. The point of no return. With a final, shuddering sigh, he pushed the key into the lock, turned it, and the heavy door swung inward with a silent, well-oiled grace. The interior was even more breathtaking than the exterior. A grand foyer with a checkered marble floor stretched before him, a sweeping staircase with a dark, polished wood banister curving its way up to the floors above. The air smelled of beeswax, old books, and the faint, lingering scent of his grey-tant's perfume, Chanel No. 5. A woman was waiting for him at the foot of the stairs. She was in her late 60s, with a ramrod-straight posture that spoke of a lifetime of discipline. Her gray hair was pinned in a flawless bun, and she wore a simple but impeccably tailored black dress with a string of pearls at her throat. This had to be Mrs. Davies. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was clipped and British, with an accent that could cut glass. Her eyes, a pale, piercing blue, swept over him, taking in his jeans, his worn-out sneakers, his coffee-stained shirt. It wasn't a look of judgment, but of clinical assessment, as if she were a museum curator examining a piece of art that had been stored incorrectly. "You must be the new resident." "Alex Ryder," he managed to say, his voice sounding rough and out of place in the grand space. "Indeed," she replied, a single, perfectly sculpted eyebrow arching slightly. "We were, however, expecting Miss Alexandra Dubois." "No matter. We have much to do." She clapped her hands once, a sharp, authoritative sound. Immediately, a young woman in a maid's uniform appeared from a side hallway. "Maria, please take Mr. Ryder's luggage." Maria, a girl with wide, curious brown eyes, took his single, pathetic backpack from him. Mrs. Davies turned her attention back to Alex. "Follow me, please. Your rooms are on the second floor. A bath has been drawn. Afterwards, we will begin the initial fitting and consultation." "Consultation?" Alex asked, following her up the grand staircase. His sneakers squeaked softly on the polished wood. "Of course," she said without turning around. "We cannot have you living in a state of sartorial ambiguity. The terms of the will are precise. A complete feminine presentation is required. We must assess your measurements, skin tone, hair, and bone structure to create a suitable wardrobe and daily regimen." Genevieve was very clear. This is not to be a pantomime. It is to be an embodiment. The room Mrs. Davies led him to was less a bedroom and more a private suite. It was vast and airy, with high ceilings and a fireplace of carved white marble. A large four-poster bed, draped in cream-colored silk, dominated the center. But Alex's eyes were drawn to the series of doors along the far wall. Mrs. Davies gestured to the first door. "Your bathroom. The next, your dressing room. And the last, your closet. Currently, it is empty. We will rectify that tomorrow." The bathroom was a sanctuary of marble and gold fixtures. Steam rose from a clawfoot tub that was big enough to swim in, the water scented with something floral and expensive. Laid out on a marble vanity were not his familiar bar of soap and generic shampoo, but an intimidating array of crystal bottles and porcelain jars filled with creams, oils, and lotions. "Your bath is ready," Mrs. Davies announced. "On the vanity, you will find a depilatory cream. The instructions are on the bottle. A complete lack of body hair is the foundational canvas for a feminine aesthetic. I will return in 1 hour to begin your measurements. Please be ready." She turned and left, closing the door with a soft, final click. Alex stood alone in the steam-filled bathroom, his mind reeling. Depilatory cream. He picked up the heavy glass jar. The instructions were simple, the implications monumental. He was expected to strip himself of one of the most fundamental markers of his masculinity. He looked at his reflection in the vast, gilt-edged mirror. He saw a man. Tired, scared, with a day's worth of stubble on his jaw and a light dusting of hair on his chest and arms. This was Alex. And he was about to start erasing him. An hour later, feeling raw, strangely smooth, and utterly demoralized, Alex sat wrapped in a thick, plush robe on a velvet chaise longue in the dressing room. His skin tingled from the chemical hair remover. Running a hand over his calf was a bizarre sensation. It was as smooth and soft as polished stone. Mrs. Davies returned, punctual to the second. She was carrying a leather-bound notebook and a tailor's measuring tape. She didn't comment on his new, hairless state. Her demeanor was that of a doctor conducting a physical exam, impersonal and efficient. "Stand, please," she commanded. For the next 20 minutes, she subjected him to the most thorough and humiliating examination of his life. She measured everything. His chest, his waist, his hips, the inseam and outseam of his legs, the breadth of his shoulders, the circumference of his neck. Her hands were cool and firm, her touch clinical as she wrapped the tape measure around his body, calling out numbers in a low, clear voice and jotting them down in her notebook. "Shoulders are broad, but not unmanageably so," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Waist is narrow for a male frame. Hips are slight, we will need to create the illusion of a curve. Legs are long, a good feature." Finally, she was done with the measurements. "Sit," she ordered, gesturing to a vanity table with a large, brightly lit mirror. He sat, and she began to examine his face, her fingers gently tilting his chin this way and that. "Good bone structure," she noted. "Jaw is strong, but we can soften it with contouring. Eyebrows are unruly, they will need to be shaped. Skin is in decent condition, though dehydrated." She made more notes in her book, then stood back, her head tilted, her pale blue eyes narrowed in concentration. "Yes," she said finally, a note of satisfaction in her voice. "I believe we have a solid foundation to work with. The canvas is prepped. Tomorrow, the artistry begins." Alex woke the next morning tangled in silk sheets, the unfamiliar softness a disorienting first sensation. For a brief, blissful moment, He didn't remember where he was. Then, the events of the previous night crashed down on him, and he ran a hand over his impossibly smooth leg, the bizarre reality of his situation returning with a jolt. He found a set of clothes laid out for him on the chaise longue. Not his old jeans and t-shirt, but a pair of simple, gray silk lounge pants and a matching long-sleeved top. They were androgynous, but the fabric was so light and fluid against his skin that it felt undeniably feminine. It was his first lesson in the power of texture. After a breakfast, he ate alone in a sun-drenched dining room, served by the silent and ever-watchful Maria. Mrs. Davies appeared. "Good morning, Miss Alexandra," she said, using the new name for the first time. It sounded so foreign that for a second, Alex didn't realize she was talking to him. "We have a busy day. The specialists are here." The specialists were a team of 3 people waiting for him in a sitting room that had been converted into a makeshift salon. There was a chic, wiry man named Antoine who was introduced as his hairstylist, a severe-looking woman with sharp, black-rimmed glasses named Helena, his esthetician, and a flamboyant, cheerful man named Julian, who was simply called the couturier. They descended upon him like a flock of well-dressed, highly critical vultures. Antoine tooted at his tragically uninspired haircut. Helena peered at his pores through a magnifying glass with a grimace. Julian circled him, taking in his measurements and sighing dramatically. "The shoulders are a challenge, of course," Julian lamented, "but the waist. And the legs. We can work with this." "Oh yes. I'm thinking classic silhouettes. A-lines, wrap dresses. We will create a swan, darling. A veritable swan." The deconstruction of Alex began. Helena went first, subjecting him to an hour of facial treatments. Creams were applied and removed, his face was steamed, and then came the tweezers. The shaping of his eyebrows was a meticulous, agonizing process. Each pluck was a tiny, sharp sting that made his eyes water. But when she was done and handed him a mirror, the change was startling. His thick, straight brows were now thinner, with a soft, elegant arch that fundamentally altered the landscape of his face. His eyes seemed larger, more open. It was a subtle shift, but a profoundly feminizing one. Next was Antoine. He spent 2 hours lightening Alex's drab brown hair to a warm, rich chestnut, adding subtle highlights that caught the light. He then cut and styled it, leaving it longer on top and sides, styling it in a way that swept across his forehead, cleverly concealing the sharp corners of his hairline and softening the line of his jaw. "For now, it is a chic gamine look," Antoine declared. "But we are growing it out. The goal is a classic bob, just below the chin." He ran a brush through the finished style, and Alex felt the surprisingly pleasant sensation of the soft bristles against his scalp and the way the longer strands tickled his ears. He looked prettier. There was no other word for it. He felt like a car being stripped for parts, polished, and reassembled into something entirely new. He was no longer in control of his own appearance. He was a project, a canvas, and these were the master artists hired to create a masterpiece, whether he liked it or not. The final and most intimidating part of the day belonged to Julian. After a light lunch, Mrs. Davies led Alex, or Alexandra, as he was now beginning to think of this emerging stranger, to the 3rd floor, which housed a ballroom converted into a vast, custom atelier. Racks of luxurious fabrics lined one wall, and half-finished garments were draped over dress forms. Julian was in his element, a whirlwind of creative energy. "Now, for the foundation," he announced with a flourish. He clapped his hands, and an assistant appeared with a series of large, elegant boxes. Alex had assumed they would start with dresses or blouses. He was wrong. Julian opened the first box, and Alex's throat went dry. Inside, nestled on a bed of tissue paper, was lingerie. Not the practical cotton kind, but intricate, architectural creations of lace, silk, and satin. "One cannot build a beautiful house on a shoddy foundation," Julian declared, his voice echoing in the large room. "Lingerie is the secret architecture of the feminine form. It shapes, it smooths, it creates the silhouette." He held up a matching set, a delicate underwire bra in a deep sapphire blue lace and a pair of coordinating panties. This is where we begin. The first layer of Alexandra. Mrs. Davies, ever present and ever watchful, stepped forward. "The fitting rooms are this way," she said, her voice betraying no hint of the inherent awkwardness of the situation. Alone in the opulent fitting room, Alex stared at the garments. This felt different from the depilatory cream or the eyebrow tweezing. This was intimate. This was clothing that was designed not just to be worn, but to be felt, to be experienced. With clumsy, fumbling fingers, he tried to figure out the bra. After a minute of pathetic struggle, a soft knock came at the door. "May I assist?" It was Mrs. Davies. Before he could answer, she entered. With the same clinical efficiency she had used to measure him, she showed him how to fasten the bra in the front and then twist it around. She adjusted the straps on his broad shoulders, her touch professional yet unnervingly personal. The band was snug around his ribcage, a constant, constricting pressure. The empty lace cups were a hollow mockery against his flat chest. Then, she handed him the panties. He turned away, his face burning with a shame so profound it felt like a physical heat, and stepped into them. The silk was cool and smooth against his newly bare skin. The fit was strange. It was confining and yet revealing in a way his old boxers had never been. "Now, the final touch for today's foundation," Mrs. Davies said, her voice still perfectly even. She opened another box. Inside was a corset. It wasn't an old-fashioned, heavy-duty contraption, but a modern, elegant piece of shapewear, a waist cincher made of firm, elasticated satin with delicate boning. "This will help train your waist and improve your posture," she explained as she wrapped it around his midsection. She pulled the laces tight in the back, and Alex gasped as he felt the garment cinch him in, creating a pressure that was both restricting and oddly supportive. It forced him to stand up straighter, pushing his shoulders back. She led him to a three-way mirror. Alex stared, his mind a battlefield of horror and a strange, forbidden fascination. The man he knew was still there, but he was being reshaped. The fine lace of the bra created a delicate pattern on his skin. The silk of the panties hugged his hips, and the waist cincher dramatically narrowed his midsection, creating the illusion of a more feminine, hourglass figure. He didn't look like a woman. Not yet. But the stark, masculine lines of his body were being systematically blurred, redrawn by an invisible hand. The next few weeks were a relentless, immersive boot camp in the art of being Alexandra. Every day was a structured schedule of lessons, a curriculum designed by Mrs. Davies with the precision of a military campaign. His masculinity wasn't just being dismantled, it was being replaced, system by system. Mornings were for the body. A stern, wiry woman named Anya, a former ballerina, came 3 times a week to teach him how to move. "A man walks to get somewhere. A woman walks to arrive," she would say, her voice sharp and critical. "Stop stomping, Alexandra. You are not killing insects. You are gliding." The biggest hurdle, of course, was the shoes. He started with low, 2-inch block heels. Even those felt like instruments of torture. His weight was pitched forward, his calves ached, and he wobbled around the grand ballroom like a newborn deer. One afternoon, Anya decided a more direct approach was needed. She had him put on a pair of 3-inch stilettos and then, to his utter horror, she tied a silk sash tightly around his knees, binding his legs so he could only take small, mincing steps. "You are fighting the shoes," she declared. "You must surrender to them. Let the shoe dictate the movement. The hips must lead. Sway, Alexandra. It is a dance." He spent an hour shuffling awkwardly across the marble floor, his knees bound, his ankles screaming in protest. But a strange thing began to happen. To keep his balance, he was forced to engage his core and move his hips in the gentle, rolling gait Anya had been describing. It was clumsy and exaggerated, but for the first time, he felt the rhythm she was talking about. It was the rhythm of a woman's walk. Afternoons were for the voice. A patient, kind-faced man named Dr. Albright was his vocal coach. He explained that the goal wasn't to create a fake, high-pitched falsetto, which would be unsustainable and immediately obvious. "We are looking for your head voice," he explained, his own voice a soothing baritone. "We all have it. It's about resonance. Men typically speak from the chest. We need to teach you to bring that resonance up into the mask of your face. The exercises were bizarre. He spent hours humming, practicing sighing sounds, and repeating sing-song phrases. The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain, he recited, focusing on keeping the vibration in his nose and forehead, not his chest. It was a slow, frustrating process. His voice would crack, dropping back into its familiar masculine register, and Dr. Albright would patiently correct him. But gradually, a new voice began to emerge. It was still his, but it was softer, higher in pitch, with a lighter, more melodic cadence. It was Alexandra's voice. Evenings were for study. Mrs. Davies would provide him with a stack of fashion magazines and books on etiquette. He was expected to learn the difference between Dior and Chanel, between a fish fork and a salad fork. He was being programmed, not just with a new body and a new voice, but with a new set of cultural knowledge. Through it all, he wore the clothes Julian had begun to create for him. Simple at first, tailored blouses, elegant A-line skirts, cashmere sweaters, always paired with heels and the foundational lingerie. The clothes were changing him. He couldn't slouch on the couch in a silk blouse and pencil skirt. He couldn't manspread while wearing a dress. The garments themselves were a constant instructor, teaching him a new way of sitting, of moving, of simply existing in space. The person who had arrived in a coffee-stained shirt and worn-out jeans was fading, and a polished, well-dressed, and increasingly convincing woman was taking his place. 2 months into the experiment, the name Alexandra stopped feeling like a costume. It was becoming a skin he was slowly, reluctantly, growing into. The reflection in the mirror was a paradox that no longer sent him into a spiral of panic. The face was his, but the arched brows, the soft chestnut bob, and the subtle makeup made it hers. His body, reshaped by corsetry and posture training, now looked natural in the elegant clothes that filled his closet. The staff, under Mrs. Davies's unwavering command, had never called him anything but Miss Alexandra. The constant reinforcement, combined with the physical and vocal changes, was having a profound psychological effect. Sometimes, when he was alone, he would whisper his old name, Alex, and the sound was a dull, foreign syllable. It was then that Mrs. Davies decided he was ready for the next phase of his education, the public debut. "There is a charity gala for the Museum of Fine Arts on Friday evening," she announced one morning over breakfast. "Your great-aunt was a significant patron. A table has been reserved in her name. You will be attending." A cold, sharp spike of fear pierced through the strange new comfort he had been building. In public? With people? They'll know. Someone will know. "Know what, Miss Alexandra?" Mrs. Davies asked, her voice cool and level. "That a beautiful, well-dressed young woman has come to support a worthy cause? The staff and specialists have done their work. The rest is up to you. This is not a rehearsal. It is a performance." The day of the gala was a blur of intense preparation. Julian arrived with the gown, a creation that took Alex's breath away. It was a floor-length sheath of deep emerald green silk that shimmered like a jewel. It was sleeveless, with a high neckline, but the back was cut daringly low. It was both elegant and incredibly sensual. Antoine came to style his hair, which was now long enough to be swept into a sophisticated chignon at the nape of his neck. Helena did his makeup, a more dramatic evening look with a smoky eye and a classic red lip. As she worked, her fingers applying the fine liquid eyeliner with a surgeon's precision, she gave him a rare piece of personal advice. "The secret, my dear, is not to hide," she said, her voice a low murmur. "It is to project. Do not look at the floor. Meet their gaze. Inhabit the beauty we have created. People see what you allow them to see." The final touches were a pair of diamond drop earrings from Genevieve's vault and a pair of wickedly high, strappy black stilettos. When Alex stood before the full-length mirror, he felt a profound sense of dislocation. The woman staring back was a complete stranger. She was tall, elegant, and arrestingly beautiful. She looked confident, wealthy, and a little intimidating. For a terrifying, exhilarating moment, he believed in her completely. The ride to the museum was silent. Alex's hands, with their perfectly manicured, nude-polished nails, were clenched. The ballroom was a dazzling, overwhelming sea of couture gowns, tuxedos, and the blinding flash of cameras. The air hummed with the sound of a string quartet, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the low, confident chatter of the city's elite. Alexandra stepped out of the limousine, and the cold night air felt sharp against the bare skin of her back. She took a steadying breath, the boning of her evening corset a firm, reassuring pressure around her ribs. She walked up the grand, red-carpeted steps, one hand held lightly on the arm of a silent, imposing bodyguard Mrs. Davies had hired for the evening. The click of her stilettos on the marble was a sharp, feminine sound, a rhythm she had practiced for weeks. She could feel the eyes on her, the curious glances, the appreciative once-overs. But no one pointed. No one stared in disbelief. They just saw a striking woman making an entrance. Helena was right. They saw what she projected. The table was in a prime location near the dance floor. Several of the city's older, wealthier patrons, people who had known Genevieve, were already seated. An elegant woman with a helmet of perfect silver hair and a formidable diamond necklace looked up as she approached. "My dear," the woman said, her voice a theatrical drawl. "You must be Genevieve's mysterious heir. I'm Beatrice Stanhope. Your great-aunt and I were sparring partners at 100 different auction houses." Alexandra found her voice, the soft, melodic instrument Dr. Albright had helped her craft. "A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Stanhope. I'm Alexandra Dubois." She extended a hand, and Beatrice took it, her rings cold against Alexandra's skin. "Dubois," Beatrice repeated, her sharp eyes scanning Alexandra's face. "Of course. You have her eyes. That same intelligent, almost mischievous spark. And her taste in jewelry, I see." The conversation flowed around her. They spoke of art, of travel, of Genevieve's legendary eccentricities. Alexandra kept her answers brief and polite, just as Mrs. Davies had instructed. She was the quiet, mysterious heiress. The role was surprisingly easy to play. Then, a man approached the table. He was younger than the others, probably in his early 30s, with a head of tousled dark hair, a confident smile, and a tuxedo that was tailored to perfection. He wasn't classically handsome, but he radiated an energy and a charm that was magnetic. "Beatrice, you look as stunning as ever," he said, his voice a warm, smooth baritone. His eyes, a startlingly bright blue, then moved to Alexandra. They widened slightly, and his charming smile became something more genuine, more focused. "And you have not introduced me to your lovely companion." Beatrice chuckled. "Manners, Jacob. This is Alexandra Dubois, Genevieve's great niece." "Alexandra, this charming rogue is Jacob Thorne. His family owns half the galleries in this city, and he's unfortunately inherited their eye for beautiful things." Jacob Thorne took Alexandra's hand. He didn't shake it. He lifted it halfway to his lips, his gaze never leaving hers. "A genuine pleasure, Miss Dubois. I was a great admirer of your aunt. She had an impeccable, fearless eye." "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," Alexandra replied, her heart giving a strange, unfamiliar flutter. "Please call me Jacob," he said, his smile deepening. He finally released her hand, but the warmth of his touch lingered. "And I must say, Beatrice is right. You have your aunt's spark. Would you do me the honor of a dance?" The string quartet was playing a slow, elegant waltz. A sea of couples swirled on the dance floor under the glittering light of a massive crystal chandelier. Jacob led Alexandra by the hand into the throng. He put one hand firmly on the bare skin of her lower back, and his other hand enveloped hers. The contact was electric. His hand was warm and strong against her skin, a jolt of masculine energy that was both terrifying and thrilling. She placed her free hand on his shoulder, the fine wool of his tuxedo jacket smooth under her palm. "Don't worry," he murmured, his voice low and close to her ear. "I'll lead." He swung her into the rhythm of the dance, his movements sure and confident. For the first few moments, Alexandra was stiff, a nervous wreck, concentrating only on the steps Anya had drilled into her. But Jacob was an excellent dancer. He guided her effortlessly, his body a solid, reassuring anchor. Slowly, she began to relax. She let go of the rigid focus on her feet and allowed herself to follow his lead. The emerald silk of her gown swished around her legs. The diamonds at her ears glittered as she turned. She looked up at him, and he was smiling down at her, a look of open admiration in his bright blue eyes. "You're a natural, Alexandra," he said. "Have you been hiding your dancing skills?" "My great-aunt believed a well-rounded education was essential," she replied, the pre-rehearsed line coming easily to her lips. They danced in a comfortable silence for a moment, the music swelling around them. His proximity was doing strange things to her. She could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, a mix of sandalwood and citrus. She was acutely aware of the solid muscle of his chest, the strength in the hand that held hers. This was a level of physical intimacy with a man she had never experienced. As Alex, his interactions had always been casual, a handshake, a pat on the back. This was different. This was formal, romantic, and it was happening to her, to Alexandra. "So," Jacob said, his voice pulling her from her thoughts. "The whole city is buzzing with curiosity about you. The mysterious heiress who appeared out of nowhere. What's your story?" "I'm not sure it's much of a story," she said, deflecting. "I was a freelance designer. My life was very quiet. This is all very new to me." "Quiet suits you," he said, his gaze intense. "There's a serenity about you. It's captivating." His words, a simple compliment, landed with a surprising weight. He wasn't just being polite. He was flirting. With her. With Alexandra. A hot blush crept up her neck, a genuine, uncontrollable reaction that had nothing to do with Alex Ryder. It was the blush of a woman who is being courted by a handsome, charming man, and, to her utter astonishment, she found herself enjoying it. The fear that had been her constant companion all night was slowly being replaced by a nervous, exhilarating excitement. The performance was becoming real. As the waltz came to a graceful end, Jacob didn't immediately release her. His hand lingered on her back for a moment longer than necessary. "May I get you some champagne?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. She nodded, her throat suddenly too dry to speak. He led her off the dance floor to the edge of the ballroom, near a series of French doors that opened onto a stone terrace overlooking the museum gardens. He returned a moment later with 2 flutes of champagne. "To Genevieve," he said, raising his glass. "For having such an extraordinary eye for beauty, and for bringing you here." They touched glasses, the delicate chime lost in the noise of the gala. Alexandra took a sip, the cool, bubbling liquid a welcome sensation. The terrace was quieter than the ballroom, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight and fairy lights strung through the trees. "It's a bit overwhelming in there," Jacob said, gesturing with his head towards the crowded room. "I've always preferred the edges of parties." "Me too," Alexandra admitted, the words coming out before she could think. It was the truth. Alex Ryder had always been a wallflower. Jacob smiled, a knowing, intimate expression. "I had a feeling you might be. You don't seem like the type who needs to be the center of attention, even though you command it without trying." They stood in a comfortable silence, watching the dancers in the ballroom. The night was growing cooler and a light breeze swept across the terrace, raising goosebumps on Alexandra's bare arms and back. She shivered slightly. Instantly, Jacob was shrugging out of his tuxedo jacket. "Here," he said, "you're freezing." Before she could protest, he was draping the jacket over her shoulders. It was heavy and still warm from his body heat. The lining was smooth silk, and the jacket enveloped her in his scent of sandalwood and citrus. It was an incredibly chivalrous, almost old-fashioned gesture. It was also deeply, profoundly intimate. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling the lapels closer. "My pleasure," he replied, his voice soft. He was standing closer now. The space between them had shrunk, charged with a new energy. "Alexandra," he began, his tone growing more serious. "I know we've only just met, but I feel a connection. I'm not usually this forward, but would you consider having dinner with me sometime? Away from all this." The request hung in the air between them, shimmering with possibility. Her mind was a frantic cacophony. "Say no. It's a game. It's not real. You're not real." But her heart, the foolish, traitorous thing, was pounding a frantic, hopeful rhythm. She looked at his face, at the genuine hope in his bright blue eyes. He wasn't asking a costume out to dinner. He was asking her. And the woman she was becoming, the woman who had danced in his arms and was now wrapped in the warmth of his jacket, wanted to say yes. "I'd like that very much, Jacob," Alexandra heard herself say, her voice steady and clear. His face broke into a brilliant, relieved smile. "Wonderful. May I have your number?" It was the moment the entire illusion could have shattered. She had no number. Alexandra Dubois didn't technically exist. But Mrs. Davies, the grand strategist, had prepared for every eventuality. A brand new phone with a new number had been in her evening bag. "Of course," she said, retrieving the slim, elegant device. As she recited the number, a thought, both terrifying and thrilling, struck her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a performance anymore. She was building a life, a real life, for a woman who was supposed to be a fiction. The weeks following the gala were a strange, bifurcated existence. By day, Alexandra's life was a meticulously scheduled regimen of lessons and fittings within the cloistered walls of the brownstone. She was still a project, a creation being constantly refined by Mrs. Davies and her team of specialists. Her hair grew longer, now a perfect, glossy bob. Her voice settled into its new, softer register. Her walk in heels became second nature, a graceful, fluid motion that required no conscious thought. But by night and on weekends, she was Jacob's Alexandra. He called her the very next day. Their first date was a quiet dinner at an intimate Italian restaurant. She was a nervous wreck, but Jacob's easy charm quickly put her at ease. He was funny, intelligent, and an incredible listener. He asked about her life as a designer, and she found herself weaving stories, embellishing Alex's quiet, solitary work with a passion and flair that felt like Alexandra's own. Thus began a slow, careful courtship. They went to art galleries, to jazz clubs, to quiet, late-night movies. Jacob was a perfect gentleman, attentive and respectful. He never pushed, never pried too deeply into her mysterious past. He seemed content to simply get to know the woman she was now. And Alexandra, to her profound confusion, found herself falling for him. It was a love affair with a built-in time bomb. Every compliment he gave her, every time he called her beautiful or brilliant, was a twist of the knife. He was falling in love with a masterpiece of artifice. The guilt was a constant, gnawing presence. The dynamic within the brownstone began to shift. Mrs. Davies observed the courtship with a hawk-like intensity. She was no longer just a warden. She was a director, carefully managing Alexandra's performance. "You will wear the blue silk blouse for your lunch with Mr. Thorne," she would instruct. "It brings out the color of your eyes," which he has complimented twice. Or, "Remember to mention the Rococo art exhibit. I have left a book on the period on your nightstand. It will demonstrate a shared interest." Alex, the man, was now a ghost in the machine, a silent operator pulling the levers of a puppet that was becoming more real than he was. He felt a growing resentment towards Mrs. Davies and the will that had trapped him. But his resentment was hopelessly tangled with his growing affection for Jacob. He wanted to be with Jacob, and the only way to do that was to be Alexandra. The true crisis point came one rainy Saturday afternoon. They were at Jacob's spacious, modern apartment, filled with art and books. They had spent the day laughing, talking, and just enjoying each other's company. As they stood by a large window, watching the rain streak down the glass, Jacob turned to her. "Alexandra," he said, his voice soft and serious. He gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "I think I'm falling in love with you." And then he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't like the chaste, formal kisses they had shared at the end of their dates. This was a kiss of deep, unrestrained passion. It was tender and demanding, and it shattered Alex's remaining defenses. She kissed him back with a desperation that was startling. All the lies, all the guilt, all the confusion melted away, leaving only the profound, undeniable truth of her feelings for this man. When the kiss ended, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers. The illusion was perfect. Too perfect. He wanted her, this woman in his arms. And she wanted him. But the body he was in, the body Jacob was caressing, was a temporary construction, a magical, year-long loan. The thought was a shard of ice in her heart. The kiss and the declaration of love that preceded it became a fault line, splitting Alexandra's existence into a before and an after. The guilt, once a manageable, low-level hum, became a deafening roar. Jacob's affection, which had been a source of thrilling validation, now felt like an accusation. He began to talk about the future. Their future. He spoke of traveling together, of meeting his parents, of the life they could build. Each mention was a fresh wave of panic for Alexandra. The one-year deadline, which had once seemed like a distant, abstract concept, now loomed like a guillotine. She grew distant, haunted. Jacob noticed the change. "Is everything all right, Alexandra?" he asked one evening as they walked through a park, the autumn leaves crunching under their feet. "You seem a million miles away." "I'm sorry," she said, forcing a smile. "I just have a lot on my mind." "Is it about your aunt's estate?" he prompted gently. "You're still the executor, aren't you?" It was a perfect excuse, a plausible reason for her distraction. Yes, she latched onto it, grateful. "It's all very complicated. Lawyers, accountants, it's a lot to handle." He accepted the explanation, but the worry in his eyes remained. He was in love with a ghost, a woman who seemed to be fading before his very eyes. The strain was becoming unbearable. Alex felt like he was fracturing from the inside out. He was living a lie so profound that he was beginning to lose track of where Alex ended and Alexandra began. His old self felt like a distant dream, a faded photograph of a stranger. But Alexandra's future was a dead end. He had to do something. He couldn't keep lying to Jacob. But what was the alternative? Tell him the truth? The absurdity of it was laughable. "Hi, Jacob. The woman you're in love with is actually a man who is legally obligated to live this way for a year to get an inheritance." It was insane. He would lose him forever. He decided to confront the architect of his gilded cage, Ms. Reed. He booked an appointment under Alexandra's name. Walking into the law office, no longer as the terrified, coffee-stained Alex, but as the poised and elegant Miss Du Bois, was a surreal experience. The receptionist greeted her with a deferential smile. Ms. Reed was waiting, her office as cold and imposing as ever. She looked up as Alexandra entered, her sharp eyes taking in the tailored Chanel suit, the perfect hair, the quiet confidence in her posture. "Miss Du Bois," she said, her voice betraying a flicker of, was it approval? "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Alexandra sat down in the chair opposite the desk. "I want to end it," she said, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts. "And what, precisely?" Ms. Reed asked, steepling her fingers. "The arrangement. The clause in the will. I can't do it anymore." Ms. Reed leaned back, her expression unreadable. "You are aware that nullifying the clause would mean forfeiting the entire inheritance. You would be left with nothing. You would have to walk out of that brownstone with only the clothes on your back." "I know," Alexandra whispered, the thought of returning to that level of poverty a cold knot in her stomach. "May I ask what has prompted this change of heart?" the lawyer inquired. "According to Mrs. Davies's reports, you have been adapting exceptionally well." Alexandra took a deep, shaky breath. "I've met someone. And this whole thing, it's a lie. It's not fair to him." Ms. Reed was silent for a long moment, her gaze analytical. She said finally. "Mr. Thorne." "Yes, Mrs. Davies has been very thorough in her reports." She paused. "And you believe telling Mr. Thorne the truth would be preferable?" "I don't know," Alexandra admitted, her voice cracking. "But I can't keep lying to him." Ms. Reed looked down at the will, open on her desk. "Genevieve was a romantic," she said, almost to herself. But she was also a pragmatist. She believed in grand gestures, but also in unavoidable consequences. She looked up, her gaze pinning Alexandra to her seat. "The will is absolute. There is no provision for early termination without forfeiture. You have 7 months remaining on your contract, Miss Du Bois. My advice, as your legal counsel, is to see it through. What you choose to do after that is your own affair." The meeting with Ms. Reed was a dead end, a confirmation of the bars on her cage. Alexandra left the office feeling more trapped than ever. The choice was stark and impossible: keep the lie and Jacob for 7 more months, only to lose him in a catastrophic revelation, or give up everything, the money, the security, and Jacob, right now. She spent the next few days in a fog of despair, avoiding Jacob's calls and texts with flimsy excuses. The brownstone, once a symbol of her salvation, now felt like an elaborate, luxurious prison. It was Mrs. Davies who finally broke through her stupor. She entered Alexandra's suite one evening without knocking, finding her sitting in the dark, still in her day dress, staring at the rain-streaked windows. "This will not do," Mrs. Davies said, her voice sharp but not unkind. She switched on a soft lamp. "Moping is an indulgence, and it is unbecoming. What do you want me to do?" Alexandra asked, her voice hollow. "The will is absolute. My lawyer said so. Ms. Reed is a lawyer." "Her world is black and white print on a page," Mrs. Davies replied, sitting down on the edge of a velvet armchair. It was the first time Alex had ever seen her sit in his presence. Genevieve, however, lived in a world of vibrant, chaotic color. And she adored loopholes. Alexandra looked up, a flicker of hope igniting in her chest. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Davies's expression was serious. "The will states you must live as a woman for 1 year. It requires a complete feminine presentation. It does not, however, specify what kind of woman you must be." The implication hung in the air. All this time, Mrs. Davies continued, a new, almost conspiratorial tone in her voice. "We have been molding you into a reflection of Genevieve. An elegant, high society heiress. But that is only one interpretation of the term woman. The will demands honesty, does it not? An honest embodiment of the role." "I don't understand," Alexandra whispered. "Perhaps," Mrs. Davies said, standing up, her posture once again ramrod straight, "the most honest thing a woman in your position can do is to tell the man she loves the truth." The conversation was a key, unlocking a door Alexandra hadn't even realized was there. It wasn't about breaking the rules, but about redefining them. For the first time in months, she felt a surge of agency. The decision was still terrifying, the outcome uncertain, but it was hers to make. She called Jacob and asked him to come to the brownstone. He arrived that evening, his face etched with worry. She led him not to the formal sitting room, but to the library, a cozier space filled with books and the scent of old leather. She was wearing a simple cashmere sweater and a soft, pleated skirt, clothes that felt less like a costume and more like her own skin. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Jacob," she began, her voice trembling. "There's something I have to tell you. It's going to sound insane. And I need you to just listen." And so, she told him. Everything. She started with Alex Ryder, the broke graphic designer. She told him about the great-aunt he'd barely known, the bizarre will, the eviction notice that had forced his hand. She told him about Mrs. Davies, the lessons, the specialists, the slow, systematic transformation into Alexandra. As she spoke, she watched his face cycle through a storm of emotions: confusion, disbelief, a flicker of anger, and then something else. Something she couldn't read. He said nothing, just listened, his gaze fixed on her face. When she finished, the silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. She couldn't bear to look at him. She stared at her hands, clenched in her lap, bracing for the inevitable explosion, the disgust, the final, painful rejection. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. His voice was quiet, strained. "So, the woman I've been dating, the woman I fell in love with, she's a contract?" The word contract landed like a stone, cold and heavy. "No," Alexandra whispered, finally daring to look up at him. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining the makeup Helena had so carefully applied that morning. "The situation is a contract. The performance was a contract. But the feelings, my feelings for you, they were never part of the deal. They're the only real thing in all of this." Jacob stood up and walked to the fireplace, turning his back to her. He ran a hand through his dark, tousled hair. Alexandra's heart shattered. This was it. He was processing his disgust, figuring out the kindest way to leave forever. She had been a fool to think this could end any other way. All those times, he said, his voice still quiet, but now laced with a strange, analytical tone. The gala, you were so nervous. I thought it was just shyness. But you were terrified. Yes, she choked out. And your hands, he continued, turning to face her. His expression wasn't angry. It was one of intense, bewildered concentration. I remember thinking on our first date that you had the most beautiful, elegant hands, but they were so strong. I held them and thought, this is a woman who knows her own mind. He walked slowly back towards her and crouched down in front of her chair so their eyes were level. His bright blue gaze was searching, trying to piece together an impossible puzzle. When I kissed you, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. When I told you I loved you, who was I talking to? Who was I kissing, Alexandra? Me, she said, the tears coming faster now. It was just me. I don't know who that is anymore. Alex is a ghost, and Alexandra is a lie I've been telling for so long she started to feel real. All I know is that the person who loves you is sitting in this chair, in these clothes, and is terrified of losing you. He reached out and, with a startling gentleness, wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The simple, intimate gesture was her undoing. A sob escaped her lips. He looked at her, truly looked at her, at the chestnut hair, the arched brows, the face of the woman he'd courted. And for the first time, he seemed to be looking for the man he'd never met. Let me see, he said softly. What? Let me see. Alex. The request was so unexpected, so bizarre, it shocked her into silence. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached up with a trembling hand and began to undo the pins holding her chignon in place. Her hair tumbled down, falling into its familiar bob. Then, she took a napkin from a nearby table and, with clumsy, smearing motions, began to wipe away the makeup, the lipstick, the foundation, the smoky eyeshadow. She scrubbed until her face was raw and bare, stripped of its artifice. The face that remained was a strange hybrid, a face in transition. The features were Alex's, but the eyebrows were Alexandra's. The skin was soft, the jawline still subtly his. She looked at him, feeling more exposed and vulnerable than she had at any point in the past year. This is me, she whispered. Jacob stared at the face before him for a long, silent moment. The beautiful, polished mask was gone, replaced by something raw, real, and heartbreakingly honest. He saw the fear in his eyes. He saw the man she had been and the woman she had become, both warring for existence in the same person. And then, he did something she never could have predicted. He smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small, sad, wondrous quirk of his lips. Well, Jacob said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite name. It seems I've fallen in love with a goddamn work of art. The year of the contract ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, mutual agreement. With Jacob's support, Ms. Reed was informed that Alexandra would continue to fulfill the residency and presentation clause, but she would do so on her own terms. The most important of those terms was honesty. The relationship with Jacob transformed. It was no longer a simple courtship, but a complex, fascinating exploration. Some days, she was Alexandra, the elegant woman he had fallen for. They would go to dinners and galleries, and he would hold her hand, proud to have her on his arm. On other days, in the privacy of the brownstone or his apartment, she was simply Alex. They would order pizza, watch movies in comfortable silence, and he would get to know the quiet, artistic man who had been there all along. He was in love with the person, not the presentation. Mrs. Davies, surprisingly, became a quiet ally. Seeing the genuine affection between Jacob and Alex/Alexandra, her role shifted from that of a warden to a confidant. Genevieve didn't want to create a puppet, she admitted one afternoon over tea. She wanted to force a masterpiece to emerge from a neglected canvas. I believe she would be intrigued by this outcome. When the year was officially over, the vast Du Bois fortune was transferred into Alex Ryder's name. The world was his. He could have gone anywhere, done anything. He could have packed Alexandra away in a trunk with the couture gowns and reverted to his old life. But he didn't. One crisp autumn evening, a year to the day after the gala, Alex and Jacob stood in the grand foyer of the brownstone. The house was quiet. Most of the staff had been given handsome severance packages, save for Mrs. Davies, who had agreed to stay on as household manager. Alex was dressed in a pair of impeccably tailored trousers and a soft silk blouse. His hair was a little longer, a stylish, androgynous cut. He wore no makeup, but his eyebrows were still perfectly arched. He was neither Alex nor Alexandra. He was something new, a synthesis of the two. So, Jacob said, a warm smile playing on his lips. A multimillionaire with a mansion and an identity crisis. What's next on the agenda? Alex laughed, a real, genuine sound that was a perfect blend of his old baritone and Alexandra's softer melody. He walked over to the grand mahogany table in the center of the foyer. On it were two objects, the thick, leather-bound will and a new document, a deed of trust, freshly drawn up by Ms. Reed. I've been thinking about what my aunt really wanted, Alex said, running a hand over the new document. She wanted to teach me about presentation, about aesthetics, about the power of transformation. He looked at Jacob, his eyes clear and full of a love that was no longer tangled in lies or guilt. She left me this house, this gallery of a home. And you, he said, gesturing around at Jacob's world, you spend your life filling galleries with beautiful things. He slid the new document across the table. Jacob picked it up. The title read, The Du Bois Foundation for Emerging Artists. I'm turning the brownstone into a foundation, Alex explained. A residency program for young, struggling artists who are taking risks. People who are trying to transform the world with their art. We'll give them a place to live, a stipend, and a gallery space to show their work. You'll run the arts programming, I'll handle the finances. Jacob looked from the document to Alex, his eyes shining with an emotion so profound it needed no words. And as for the name on the door, Alex said with a small, confident smile. I think it will be run by a Du Bois. Let them guess what the stands for. It was not the end Genevieve had prescribed, but it was an inheritance she would have understood. It was a legacy not of money hoarded, but of beauty created, of potential unleashed. Standing there, in the grand house that had been both his prison and his chrysalis, Alex Ryder finally knew who he was. He was not a man or a woman. He was a patron, a partner, a lover. He was a work of art, finally finished and ready to begin his own exhibition.